and welcome everyone. I'm Shelley Goldberg, Chief Green Evangelist for the Green Impact Exchange. I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this webinar, Thriving in the New Green Economy. And you are set for a treat. Today's webinar attendees will hear from our esteemed guests on important and timely ESG sustainability topics, including SEC reporting and how green initiatives can help companies' bottom lines. GIX is thrilled to have representatives from Nomura GreenTech, Columbia Business School, and the Knickerbocker Financial Group here with us. We're looking forward to our panel of experts sharing their knowledge, wisdom, and insights on various topics within ESG and sustainability. I also want to remind everyone attending, we'll have time at the end for Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions in the chat function, and we'll try our best to get to all of them. But before we kick off the panel, I want to let Dan Leibovitz, our founding member and CEO of GIX, to share a few quick words on recent developments. Dan?
Thanks, Shelley, and hello, everyone. I am Dan Leibovitz, CEO and co-founder of the Green Impact Exchange. On behalf of the entire GIX team, first, I want to thank our guests for your contribution. We sincerely appreciate you taking time to share your knowledge and wisdom with us. And thank you and welcome as well to the audience. We're excited to bring this event to you. We've been on this journey for a little under 2 years. Turning the Green Impact Exchange from an idea into a reality has been the all-consuming occupation of a team who are, each one of them, masters of their craft. And launching a stock exchange, as I'm sure you can imagine, isn't easy. It's a highly regulated business with lots of moving parts that all need to be spun up before you can trade a single share. You might even say that it's hard work, but at some level, it is hard to call it work because everyone at GIX is animated by a fundamental principle. We all believe passionately that capital markets can be a force for good and rise to the challenge of addressing climate change. We think history is on our side on this. Capital markets, and especially stock exchanges, have been engines of prosperity for generations and have allowed us to achieve things collectively that would be beyond the reach of any of us individually. We believe that in the face of this new challenge, the levers and mechanisms of capital allocation can be effective at incentivizing planet-friendly business practices. As the old saying goes, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. While this may seem obvious to this audience, it's not necessarily a widely held opinion. For sure, most corporate executives agree on a personal level that pollution is harmful and making the world cleaner is a worthwhile goal. But the reality of running a public company is that it's not that simple. As we know, the overriding purpose of a for-profit business is to maximize profit and return value to shareholders. So attention paid to climate has to be balanced with the economic realities of day-to-day business and the demands of shareholders. The capital markets can help make that balance work. From our conversations with companies, we know that you value sustainability, and we know you face unique challenges. We know that every company is at a different stage in its transformation to being sustainably minded, with varying degrees of success. At GIX, we believe that all companies, from the cleanest to the most resource-intensive, can be successful at becoming sustainably focused. Some companies need guidance, some companies need incentives, some companies need access to capital. And when GIX is up and running, we'll be there to help you in all three areas. Over the past 2 years, GIX has been making steady progress in key areas to make our vision a reality. We continue to move closer to achieving our SEC license medallion in 2024. We've had productive meetings with over 100 companies to date, helping them understand how a green orientation, coupled with dually listing on a green-focused exchange, helps their bottom line and brand identity. And now, with events like this webinar, we're beginning to spread our thought leadership about how direct involvement of capital markets is the missing ingredient that can supercharge the sustainability movement. I'm looking forward to our discussion here today, where our guests will be talking about topics relevant to that belief. Let me close by saying, as we're fond of saying here at GIX, tomorrow's blue chips will be green. Shelley, back to you.
Thanks, Dan. If anyone has any questions on what Dan has just shared with us, please feel free to reach out and we'll get your questions answered. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's guest. PJ Deschaines is the Managing Director and Global Head of Nomura GreenTech Andrea Schmitz is co-head of ESG strategy at Knickerbocker Financial Group, and Shiva Rajgopal is the Kester Kester and Burns Professor of Accounting and Auditing at Columbia Business School. Before we delve right in, I'd like to give each of you the opportunity to provide us with a brief description of your very interesting backgrounds and what got you into the field of ESG and sustainability. Let's start with you, PJ.
Sure, thanks, Shelley. So as Shelley mentioned, I am the head of a group within Nomura's investment bank called Nomura GreenTech. We're actually the largest coverage unit inside of Nomura's international bank, with about 160 bankers across Asia, North America, and Europe. And the concept behind what we've done is we've redesigned a coverage group, an industry coverage group, to span a number of different traditional areas, such as energy, infrastructure, industrials, and technology, all in one group with a focus on the energy and sustainability transition. So I've been doing this in some form for about 15 years. And prior to that, got my start in finance, focused on structured finance in renewable energy with GE Capital.
Great. Thank you, PJ. Andrea, you're up.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I work at Knickerbocker Financial Group, KFG, and we do investments in early stage companies, including on ESG companies. And I've been in the world of green for a very long time. I started my career many years ago at the Environmental Protection Agency as a regulator. I worked on cleaning up gasoline contaminated sites and on reducing methane emissions in a voluntary fashion, which I found very easy to sign companies up to do. And then I switched from the regulator side to the regulated side and spent 25 years at Con Edison and was their vice president of environment, health, and safety before I went to Knickerbocker Financial Group. And I think what's really exciting for me about this topic, the new green economy, is I found that everyone, regulators, and communities want to be green. And when you combine environmental excellence into operations, everybody's a winner. So I think there's a lot to do in this area, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thanks, Shelley.
Thank you, Andrea. Shiva?
Hi, thanks for having me. Hi, my name is Shiva Rajgopal. I'm probably the only professor on this panel. So I've been working on, so let me begin by saying accounting to me is accountability, So I've been working on the G part of ESG for a very long time, boards, compensation structures, and so on. And I came to ESG more as a critic. I thought both sides were making very tall claims, and I just wanted to bring some evidence to bear on these claims. And as I thought deeper and deeper about the issue, I was wondering, is there even a big idea in ESG? And I'm convinced there are a couple of big ideas, which I can go into later if you are interested. So I came as a critic, and I'm now a convert, and I'm hoping to change things from the inside if possible. So I'll stop there and then give the floor back to you, Shelley. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. It's so wonderful to have such a great mix of backgrounds, including corporate, regulatory, and academia. So surely this will be interesting. So our first topic today addresses the ambiguity around forthcoming SEC reporting requirements. So the SEC has proposed rules on climate-regulated disclosures, requiring publicly traded companies, both domestic and foreign issuers, to disclose climate-related information and risks. When do you believe this SEC rule will pass and be implemented? And do you believe it will be held up in the courts only to be reduced to something much less stringent and ultimately less impactful? PJ, let's start with you.
It's a tough question. One of the things we don't try to do is predict what goes on in Washington and with the formation of legal precedents, rather try to respond to those and think about what they mean for our clients. I think it is a positive fact that California recently passed a related rule, as California has done in a number of areas of environmental and emissions related regulation, taking leadership. And California is a large economy. I think companies will qualify for regulation under SB 253. Will largely be companies that are relevant to the proposed SEC rule. So I think that will set maybe a smoothing precedent that we've seen in other areas, such as low carbon energy and low carbon fuel, with California taking leadership around carbon reduction. So that's something that we're looking towards as how companies respond as maybe a signal to what might be the future around the proposed SEC rule.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up California because that's truly an important issue. Andrea, anything to add here?
Sure. So I'm a big fan of this rule. I really think we need that kind of rigor. This is material information, and I'm a big fan. I don't know if any of you have seen Gary Gensler, the SEC chair, explained it in a really simple way, which I liked. He had a video, and he likens green to fat-free milk. And what he says is, you go to the grocery store, you're going to be shopping for fat-free milk. You can look at a label and understand what it says and compare it to other kinds of milk. And that's what we need in this new green economy. I think that it will pass, and it's possible that this rule could get held up, but there's a lot of other things kind of moving the needle. The SEC has been giving out some very interesting fines lately. I'm going to cite a couple. Deutsche Bank subsidiary DWS Investment, SEC declared that they made some misleading material statements about relating to greenwashing, and they got a $19 million penalty back in September. It's the largest greenwashing penalty that the SEC has issued. And other folks have been subject to these penalties. Bank of New York Mellon, back in May of 22, paid a $1.5 million penalty for misstatements and omissions on ESG, and others, Goldman Sachs, in terms of not following its ESG policies. That was a $4 million fine in November 22. So I think the day of reckoning and trying to make sure that this kind of accountability for what you say is what you do is here. And I think the rule will pass. I think it's already moving the needle with some of the fines and some of the attention that's being paid to this issue. So it's just a matter of time. It's here.
Great. Thank you, Andre. Those are great examples, and I love your optimism. Shiva, what do you think?
Well, I'd say, I'm going to try and predict what happens in Washington for a start, as opposed to PJ. So I think they have to worry about the election cycle. So if nothing else, something has to come out very quickly in the next 2 or 3 months, right? Because next November, you have to actually go back to the polls. And as was predicted, both the Californian rule and the SEC rule will get litigated. What might survive from that rubble? I guess scope 3 probably will not, in my view, because there's too much, negative sentiment about scope 3 in terms of measurement and compliance costs. Some version of TCFD, maybe scope 1 and 2. And if you want, we can talk about the issues with that whole GHG protocol as well. And the thing I usually tell people is that, be careful in terms of what you wish for. If you fight the SEC, then the EU is going to write your rules. So if you're a multinational and you have some kind of footprint in the EU, you have to follow some of what they do. And the CSRD type stuff is far more onerous. So it's an interesting issue, but you're right. I think both the other panelists mentioned it's changed the conversation. If you can go back and maybe look at the Californian rule, which I think said you need 1 or 2 directors of people of color and maybe women on the board. So that eventually got struck down, I think, but it did change behavior. So maybe it's already done its job is one argument, right? That it's changed the conversation. It's brought this front and center, regardless of what eventually happens. And who knows what happens next November in terms of the election cycle.
Great. Thank you, Shiva. Well, you're absolutely correct. It has changed the conversation. So that's a good start. So continuing along that subject, there has been talk of a lack of clarity around the forthcoming SEC reporting requirements, as some of you addressed. But can you address your thoughts on which SEC requirements could potentially have the greatest impact and what you think might have the least, quote, bang for the buck? Let's go in reverse order now. Shiva, why don't you start?
What will have the greatest impact? The thing is, there's already a fair amount of voluntary reporting, perhaps anticipating the rule, perhaps anticipating what's happening in the EU and so on. So eventually, when the rule does pass, it's probably going to mop up the 30, 40, maybe 30 or 30, 40% of the people who actually probably don't comply anyway. So in that sense, it might be a little bit of an anticlimax. Not because the rule itself I mean, I guess it depends on the framework that you use, right? The rule or the anticipation of the rule, the investor demand, etc., has already changed a lot of these things. People do voluntarily report quite a bit. The issue is always going to be comparability of measurement. Let's say we don't get scope 3, which I suspect we probably won't. Scope 1 and 2, is that enough? Are they similar? Do we have standards for what offsets look like? That's the next level conversation to have. I personally find the TCFD framework somewhat loosey-goosey. I mean, it's a principles-based thing. Do you have a strategy? What are your metrics? What does governance look like? I can see people eventually writing some boilerplate language around that. It may not really help us a lot. But at the very least, I think it puts climate risk front and center for the board to worry about. And I'm being the skeptical academic, I still sometimes wonder, where are the climate cash flows? Because I'm guessing it's not a risk for everyone. It's probably not as much of a crying concern over the next 3-4 years as opposed to say maybe 30 years. So we can get into conversations about horizon, how would it affect different industries differently. The one quick thing I would add, something that's not discussed enough, commodity prices. A big, where can I see cash flows from climate? Immediately I can think of commodity prices. Do we ask companies to tell us sensitivity of, say, earnings or cash flows to commodity prices? I just looked at Pepsi's 10K before we got on the call. Nothing. So that's something that I think we should think about. Maybe that to me would have a bigger impact in terms of, say, forecasting. What would Pepsi's cost structure look like? Would they be able to pass this on, et cetera, et cetera?
Thank you. That's a great point. And no matter what industry you're in, you're going to be faced with commodity price exposure. So that's truly important. Andrea, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I think clarity around the SEC rule is really important. So if I were the SEC, which I am not, I would, similar to what Shiva said, I would require scope 1 emissions. As a reminder for the audience, those are the direct emissions from what you do as a company. I would include scope 2, your indirect emissions directly associated with your operation. But I would leave out scope 3. And scope 3 is looking up and down the value chain. It looks at suppliers, customers. That is a big lift. So what I would say is keep scope 1, keep scope 2. We're starting to understand how to do that in a rigorous way that an accountant from Columbia's school would approve of, which I think is really important. But don't do scope 3 yet. We don't know enough. There's a potential to double count. And that, I think, would be the kind of clarity that we'd like to see from the SEC, if that's where they head up. I hope they do.
Great, thank you. I know there is a lot of concern around scope 3 and the somewhat daunting task of addressing that. So thank you. PJ, anything to add here?
I think it's impactful simply to have a consistent number reported around emissions, and it's not impactful in itself. I think that's a really important part of how Gensler's characterized the effort of the SEC, is we're just requiring information to be shared. But if that information is available comprehensively and consistently, then a number of stakeholders can look at that information, and whether it's on screening or evaluation, analysis of financials of companies, what those numbers and those tons imply on various levels of unit prices in offsets, in terms of the point around commodities, the point around the potential cost of bringing that down to a net zero level. I think it's actually, as I think the SEC and Gensler intended, just getting a consistent level of information comprehensively across reporting companies is a very powerful act of itself.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Thank you, PJ. So this next question, some of you have already touched upon in the last couple of questions, so I'm going to leave it up to any of you to respond, or all of you if you'd like. Because many companies have adopted major ESG reporting frameworks like TCFD and GRI, do you think it will be an easy lift for these companies to comply, or do you think there are major challenges ahead?
Who do you want to start with, Shelley? Is that me?
You can go ahead, sure, if it's on top of
I'll
your mind.
go. I have a short answer to that. I do not think that it will be a major challenge. I think it will be an easy lift. I think companies have been doing it. We did it at Con Ed, for example, TCFD. We know how to do it. We've been doing it for years. I think it makes sense. And again, I'm a fan of that in particular because companies are familiar with it. So I think it will be an easy lift.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to add to that thought?
Well, I might, if, with your permission. There'll always be non-adopters. So for those, the resistors, the smaller firms, people who think, I mean, for political reasons, they don't believe this is important. For them, it's probably going to be more of a psychological heavy lift as opposed to necessarily money and compliance. The next level conversation that I think, risk managers and boards perhaps need to have is to quantify the cash flow impact. So a lot of ESG conversations are about input, and input's fine, right? But what does that mean in terms of eventual output, which should ideally be some kind of link between the risk factor and maybe quote unquote risk and or cash flows. And I've been spending some time worrying about that. And I'm, intellectually, I kind of struggle. I mean, there are places where it matters. I think commodity prices are clear. Can I figure out a way to map some of these things to cash flows? I just throw that out as an open question, perhaps like in a classroom, to kind of have somebody brainstorm about this issue. That's where I'm stuck at now. Input's
That's
great.
really
What about
interesting.
output? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps that can be a classroom discussion for next semester. Be interesting to hear. PJ?
I think there's an interesting extension on that point, which is not every unit of emissions is created equal or offset equally. And that's, I think, a tough extension of where you're going once you do have scope 1 or scope 2 reported is where do the scope 2 emissions occur, and what is carbon is a global pollutant but is local and regionally produced. It's a much different thing to have a marginal cost of abatement in California transportation versus energy use in the southeastern United States or in kind of primary inputs in natural gas in Europe. So I think looking out there, it's a complicated question, but to the point of, okay, who's using that, and then what questions get asked around that. I think going into that next level, if I were kind of sitting in either an audit committee or sitting in the financial accounting department of a large corporate reporter, those are some of the things I think I'd want to start to anticipate of, okay, we get all this information together, and it should be, I think, relatively easy given tools that have been created over the last decade or so. But then, what questions get asked of it, and how are people looking to disaggregate that information internally are going to be some important considerations that aren't nearly as easy.
Mm-hmm. Very well taken. Good, great answer. So the last question on this topic is, it's very open-ended. What do you think is worse, greenwashing or green hushing, and why? And now for the audience, just so we're all aware of the difference between these terms, greenwashing, according to the NRDC, is the act of making false or misleading statements about environmental benefits of a product or service. Green hushing, according to KPMG, refers to a company's refusal to publicize ESG information. The company may fear pushback from stakeholders who would find its sustainability efforts lacking, or from investors who believe ESG undermines returns. Let's start with PJ.
Sure. I think the washing, the overstating or kind of misleading or over marketing is probably worse, because it gives stakeholders a disproportionate impression of what's going on. I can think of a lot of examples, but it almost becomes an aspect that and I think there have been cases of the FTC, if we just want to stick on the topic of domestic federal regulation, has looked into and penalized companies for. So that would be my view. It's much more damaging to stakeholders, whether it's investors or consumers, if they're looking at a company and what they're saying about what they're doing, and it's, you know, either what they're advertising is only representing a very small portion or a prospected portion of what they might do. It gives people a false impression about what they're buying, what they're investing into, and how they're using a company's services or products.
Great response. Thank you. Andrea, what do you think?
I agree with PJ. Greenwashing is absolutely worse. It could be a material misrepresentation of what you're doing, and that is not good. Green hushing, hey, I don't have, what matters is what companies do, not what they say. So if you don't want to publicize what you do, but you're doing great stuff and you choose your time to publicize it, I'm fine with that. So for sure, greenwashing is the problem.
Okay, thank you. Shiva, what do you think?
Well, just to give you a slightly different angle on this, unless ESG gets integrated with corporate strategy, I think the equilibrium is greenwashing. And in most companies that I come across, they're usually silos. Or we're to do something to please this noisy, stakeholder group or something. And that's the wrong reason to do anything, right? So to the extent we have a few enlightened companies where these things come together, meaning sustainability / ESG is part of your corporate strategy. If they green hush, that's fine. I mean, consistent with what both Andrea and PJ said. My conceptual problem is there are very few companies where sustainability is a part of strategy. And until we fix that problem, you'll always have greenwashing. Because by definition, these are like disconnected ideas targeted at some interest group, targeted at keeping somebody happy. That's not the reason to do all this, right? How does it integrate with your strategy? That's the bigger question to be asking.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we all agree that they're both pretty bad. I actually heard a new term just recently called green wishing, which is making promises or setting goals which are unrealistic. And that's for another discussion, but the terminology keeps continuing.
That's like me trying to lose weight. So,
so now we're on to our second topic, which addresses the current and future costs associated with achieving sustainability and green compliance. So there's been concern among companies that don't have deep pockets or deep layers of human capital to be able to meet ESG and sustainability compliance standards. For example, the SEC has released estimated costs for complying with its proposed rules, predicting first-year costs will come up to, on average, $640,000 and annual ongoing costs for issuers at $530,000. So, Andrea, what would be your advice to companies who have noble intentions to be compliant, but feel they lack the resources to get there?
So my advice is you can afford this, and the way you can afford this is look into your operations and challenge your core processes and involve your employees. And I want to give you an example from my former company. So in my former company, there's a greenhouse gas called SF6. It's a very potent gas. And we wanted to reduce emissions. Right now, there's no substitute for this gas. So basically, you're looking at reducing emissions. So we challenged mechanics, supervisors, engineers to say, hey, you guys work with this equipment. You come up with the solutions. And they embraced it wholeheartedly. They measured with precision. They found leaks. They stopped leaks. They reused the gas. They reduced emissions 98% from when they started, which was when I joined the company back in '96. And they won EPA awards. It was a voluntary EPA program. They won EPA awards. But the really amazing benefit that I saw was that they were so creative and motivated, and they loved the challenge. This is their core work. They want to do the right thing. And this became part of their culture. And so when you do that, you get the benefits of cost-effective emissions reductions, for example, a motivated workforce, and it's part of your operations. And that is the key to affordability, and that's the key to success, in my opinion.
Great answer. And culture is absolutely crucial. We always like to say, this can start at the board, but it has to trickle all the way down through the corporation to the guy at the loading dock. Everyone's got to be on board. Shiva, what do you think?
Well, it kind of goes back to my, and I love the answer, by the way, Andrea. This is like fabulous. But the idea that it has to be integrated with strategy. This is one of those examples where you actually, instead of marketing rah-rah, here is a concrete KPI, a goal, and then people start rallying around the goal. So what's the positive payoff to this? Is just not all cost. It's attracting great employees, keeping them. Perhaps it helps a little bit in terms of your product strategy, in terms of targeting customers. So instead of ESG and sustainability and green being a defensive conversation, if you were to elevate this to a cost benefit type conversation, it brings the so-called anti-ESG people, to the table to the extent they're willing to listen. And this is like any other business decision. It helps you attract better people, helps you retain better people, perhaps helps you market better products, eventually might lead to some kind of green premium if you were to issue a green bond. So there are lots of upsides that sometimes we don't talk about. So much of this has become a defensive discussion, So that's why I love Andrea's answer. I think it's great.
Yeah, great as well. And I love the green premium and the green dividend. There really is some return and some value to this. PJ, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, in line to what Shiva mentioned, and I had a business school professor myself who used the terms offense and defense, and defense is looking at costs, which is how do you improve performance, improve return to shareholders by lowering costs. And a lot of what's going to come out of reporting is identifying where, by looking at emissions, where you're using energy and where you can use energy more efficiently. And energy is getting more expensive. And it's a big component of core inflation and what's driven inflation over the last few years. So I think if companies orient towards that aspect and think about playing defense of where they can drive cost savings once they've had maybe something more of a common metric of looking at energy use, I think that's an interesting way of framing strategy around compliance. And then the other side is playing offense of where can you take what you're doing and use it to position yourself more favorably against competitors, or position your industry more favorably and generally. I think we've seen this in the cloud computing and data center industry, and pretty much table stakes in data center energy procurement is low carbon energy. It's what all the major hyperscalers are providing to their own customers, which is data centers run on electricity procured from low carbon sources. And so that in a requirement to participate in the industry now, or potentially in other industries, a way of taking your product or your service and getting a premium for it from your customers, and kind of forcing a pressure on your peers or competitors in that industry is another way of looking at this.
Great example. I love the offense defense analogy. That really works well. So Andrea, what do you think are some hidden or less obvious costs with achieving sustainability targets and compliance?
So I'll be curious what my fellow panelists think about this, but I worry about non-value added reporting burden. And I read in an article that cited the Financial Times that back in 2018, there were already 600 ESG ratings and rankings globally. And that's overwhelming to companies. And so I think if we can reduce that non-value added reporting burden in this world of ESG, we can make great inroads. That there's no benefit that I see from some of the reporting that companies are asked to do.
It's a great example. And, 600 is a daunting number, and it begs the question, which one is right, which one is wrong, which one is better. So it just leaves everyone confused. Shiva, what are your thoughts?
Well, two ideas. One, I just want to echo what Andrea said. ESG fatigue is a real problem. One has to, especially given all the crazy headlines in the Wall Street Journal op-ed page about how ESG is responsible for fill in the blank, anything that's wrong, right? So that is a concern in terms of board sentiment and employee sentiment. Second, if I may, sometimes this area is in the world of trade-off denial. There are trade-offs. So to the extent we can do well and do good, meaning, Andrea's example from before, fabulous if it helps you reach a target, but that'll eventually run out. So you'll still have a target that you're not able to meet, and then you're kind of scratching your head and trying to, buy some dubious offset or something like that. That arguably is counterproductive until technology comes along, which I hope it does. And how scalable is it? I mean, there's so many unknowns in this whole area, right? So to the extent you can do well and do good and do it at scale, and that helps you get to a target, we're all great. When you run out of that slack, then that's when one has to really worry about trade-offs.
That's so important. I mean, and particularly in energy, where at this stage we've come a long way, but still everything is a trade-off. I mean, unless you want to sit in the dark and freeze to death, we're going to have to wean our way out of fossil fuels. You just can't turn off the switch. So totally agree. PJ, thoughts?
Not a lot to add there. A concern would be industry capacity building. I think anything related to accounting and building up capacity around accounting takes some time. But given the observation that a lot of companies are doing this already, not clear how much of a real hidden cost that is, rather than something that we can burn into over a period of a few reporting cycles.
Great, thank you. So PJ, now that we have your ear again, what gold standard sustainability and ESG metrics should all companies be sure they're reporting on, regardless of their size or sector?
Yeah, I think it's really what the focus of the conversation to this point has been around, which is carbon emissions in the different scopes. Recognizing that scope 3 is difficult and very rangy. I think those get to a component of a large common element of impact that is we're trying to capture when we're talking about ESG. And ESG it's easy to say, it's very hard to define. It ranges across a lot of things that cut across a lot of different disciplines. But ultimately, when you're thinking about a transition across how we're being more efficient and sustainable with the use of energy and resources, a really cross-cutting metric is at what level of emissions you're generating in greenhouse gases. So I think you could get to other ones, but I think if you're trying to have one element that is applicable broadly to a lot of different actors, that really is it.
Great answer. I think that's really kind of the low-hanging fruit in terms of measurement, where it can be equal across the board. So that's great input. Thank you. Andrea, what do you think?
So I love this question. In terms of metrics, for example, in terms of green metrics, I would take a broad view of environmental compliance. I would include greenhouse gas emissions, but I would look at water use. I would at water conservation, spill prevention, waste management. So that's the kind of thing I would look at for metrics. And then I think Shiva has mentioned this, but report these to the board. This is where you really get attention that it needs to really make a difference, a cultural difference in a company. And I'll give you an example. We had a board KPI which had to do with not reporting spills late, doing late reporting. And that created a whole environmental management system of training employees why this is important, how to prevent spills, how to clean them up, how to report them in a timely manner. And it circled back in terms of the prevention in a really incredible way. And then if you really want to make a difference, tie that KPI to your pay, particularly for the upper management folks. You will get folks on board, and people get very creative. And again, it's about integrating that into a company's operations. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention safety. You can be a company that puts solar panels on roofs, and if you don't have the proper fall protection and your employees fall off the roof, no good. So you've got to include sort of the ancillary parts of what you're doing, including employee and public safety into your KPIs.
Great example. I think tying compensation is very important. A lot of companies are just starting to do that with upper or senior management, but really it should infiltrate down to everyone at some level. Shiva,
Well, since you said ESG, I'm going to take some creative license here and go beyond the scope of green. I'd say human capital, because I've said this on many forums. It just blows my mind that barely 15% of U.S. companies report compensation costs, public companies. This is like bizarre. It's finally going to get fixed. The FASB has asked people to start reporting compensation costs, which is amazing for folks who didn't know. But let's go deeper. Let's talk about abnormal turnover, or even just turnover. How long do people stay in your company? What's tenure, which is like a flip side of that, and we can go deeper. But at least start with maybe just labor compensation costs, employee turnover, and employee tenure. Because I know this is beyond the scope of green, but to me, that's an even more fundamental thing. And there's no dispute here. Both sides would agree that human capital is important. So from a political standpoint, that's arguably an easy sell, regardless of how your board feels about ESG.
Great. I'm glad to see we all agree, yet we all have different answers to that question. So that was great exchange. So moving on to our final topic for today, which focuses on ways in which embracing green initiatives can impact companies' bottom line. So it's been proven sustainability reduces several types of business risk: financial risk, legal risk, operational risk, etc. Where do you think the biggest short-term and long-term gains will come in terms of risk reduction? Why don't we start with you, PJ?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think we've covered some of the points here, which tie back to energy use and risk around energy supply and ultimately commodity costs. I think related to that are questions around where you're sourcing inputs. We saw this last year with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, especially in Europe, which is a lot of companies' vulnerabilities to concentrated supply, concentrated imports were really highlighted, and it was really detrimental to the operations of those companies, especially in places like Central Europe, where operations were driven to a level of extreme unprofitability by rising input costs or even just lack of input availability. So I think some of these things, when we talk about sustainability, looking at the resilience of operations and looking at what the impacts of not just change of costs, but impacts on kind of single points of failure in the value chain might be. I think some of those things can be highlighted further. I think it relates back to some of the points that were made earlier around kind of looking at spill and emissions prevention internally, and some of the kind of risks and opportunities that highlights.
Great. You're absolutely right about resilience, and it also involves being future ready for the unexpected. And there were surely you had our share of unexpected events over the last few years. So, Shiva, what are your thoughts?
Well, in the short run, just to maybe restate what PJ mentioned, I think geopolitical risk, right? We've somehow entered a bit of a crazy inflection point in history. The Israel issue, Ukraine, China is always. So I think geopolitical risk is something that probably deserves attention in the short run. In the long run, I think I've said this before. I think the ESG train has arguably left the station in the sense that everything is pointing towards sustainability, regardless of whether you like it or not. And companies are just usually pretty good at seeing where the puck is going and so on. So products for the future. What's the next gen product that you're thinking about, and is it going to appeal to our 15 plus, 20 plus, 25 plus audience, because they are your future customers, future voters, future politicians. So keeping an eye on where the world is going and coming up with products to address that need would be the long-term thing I would emphasize.
Great, and definitely it's a function of looking forward and not just what a company has done, but what they plan on doing. So that's great. And now, Andrea, with your deep experience in EH&S, you probably have some great examples tucked away there on this one.
Well, I would just say that managing risk is just good business. And if you can do a materiality assessment and help identify that risk, it could be supply chain risk. It could really expand beyond green to include all of your risk. That's just good business. I would like to just add a personal example from what Shiva said. You know, our children and grandchildren are watching what we're doing, and they're making decisions already based on ESG. So one of my examples, I have a 24-year-old daughter who over a decade ago wanted to buy a pair of shoes, but she would only buy a pair of shoes from a company that also gave a pair of shoes to a poor person somewhere in the world. And I said, and so I had to buy those shoes. And she was one of my early adopters in terms of saying she's paying attention, and she was in middle school at the time. So folks are paying attention. The needle is moving, and companies, to your point, Shiva and PJ too, we need to be ready, and we need to evolve and find those products and make them in a way that our children and grandchildren will be proud of us for. They're coming, they're the
Absolutely
market, they're
important.
here already.
Absolutely important. And I like the mindset of your daughter. Maybe we'll think of her when we're looking for interns. So given the long-term nature of sustainability programs and their payoff, how can managers reconcile and justify the time, effort, and money spent to shareholders who are typically more short-term focused? Let's start with you, PJ.
It's the tool of looking at the stream of benefits in the future and thinking about their value today, the concept of net present value. So yes, a lot of things that we have to do in a transition to using energy and resources more sustainably cost money today. We're going to make multiple trillions of dollars of investment in the transformation of our energy industrial infrastructure over the next 2 or 3 decades. And this is all going to get done because there's long-term value of that. There's long-term return over time. And so framing these initiatives of what the cost avoidance is in the future, or what even the potential gain is in the future, I think is a really important tool to bring to bear in discussing what we're doing now, in putting some of these efforts in place.
Great. Thank you. Shiva, what are your thoughts here?
Well, this is an age-old question, right? I mean, how do you deal with myopic investors? I was just going through General Motors' 10K, and they are talking about investment horizons of like 10, 15, 20 years. This is not even the EV conversation, by the way. This is the ICE conversation. So so this is no different from, say, the traditional world, where even R&D, for instance, could easily fit your description, right? You spend money now, it's risky, may or may not pan out, may take like 10 years for it to pan out. The other point I would make is that we don't talk enough about shareholder clientele, right? The marketing department spends an enormous amount of time trying to figure out who their target customer is if you're selling a product. It's the exact same conversation to have with shareholders. And if you're a public company, and let's say the top 3 are arguably quasi-permanent capital, right? BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. The owners number 4, 5, 6, 7 need to be curated, and you need to find the right kind of people to hold the stock. If you have the hit and run people, and if that affects your strategy, then that's a bigger problem to have in general. So this is a meta problem. It's not just an ESG issue. Mm-hmm. Find the right shareholder clientele is my answer.
That's a great answer, and it's not just the big guys holding the big blocks of stock, but everyone, the retail investors included. So great point. Thank you, Andrea. Something to add here?
Yeah, not a lot to add. I agree. I like what PJ said about cost avoidance. That's really important, and that's very hard to measure and prove, but that's really important. And also about having engaged shareholders that understand your business. That's another really good point that Shiva made. I think that shareholders are more patient, but again, I think that companies need to do a better job of integrating ESG into our operations, and that reduces the cost and has other benefits. So I made that point earlier, but I think that's part of the way that we can prove to folks we're spending money wisely.
Fabulous, thank you. And Andrea, I'm going to start with you for our final question of the day. Do you think a company's ESG and sustainability efforts will have more impact in terms of lowering costs or increasing revenues, or both?
Both. And I think there's additional benefits, which includes employee morale, improvements in employee in corporate culture. One last example is, on the environmental front, you often have the ability, a good company has the ability to allow people to report issues confidentially. You can call them a whistleblower. You can call ombudsman's offices are excellent places that companies should look to allow their employees to report. That kind of culture is something that could really make a difference, not just in ESG, but throughout all of the operations.
Great.
So I think there's
great
a lot of
answer. Again,
benefits.
love the positivity. PJ, how about yourself?
Mine's a variation on both, which is I think there's probably most impact in new business opportunity. I think one of the core purposes of companies is to be allocators of capital, efficient allocators of capital, and I think we've seen a lot of great examples where companies have successfully allocated capital to new business areas that highlight strategy benefits and business benefits of sustainability. A big area has been in power generation. Some of the most valuable companies in power generation globally, just in terms of not total market capitalization, but the multiples that they've garnered are in low carbon power, and they're big companies. It's I think one of the most, if not the most valuable asset in the corporate world is an investment grade balance sheet. So for large companies that have proven themselves to be very effective allocators of capital, and being able to access capital at investment grade cost of capital, which is actually an issue today now that money has actually cost something. It's not free anymore in the world with higher interest rates. Being able to take advantage of new business opportunities for some of the larger companies with access to capital is probably one of the more material things that we should expect. We've seen some great examples of that in the renewable energy industry.
Mm-hmm. Great example. You're absolutely right. The power sector is a great example, and it's also interesting to focus in on interest rates because there's a lot of people starting out in the world that have never seen these interest rates before. So to them, they're astronomical compared to what other people that have been around a while have seen. So Shiva, final words on this topic.
You put me in a spot there. Final words. I have to sound smarter and more insightful than my esteemed panelists here, co-panelists. But let me try. So your question, I think, assumes that people actually measure costs and benefits. I mean, I'd push back on that. There's usually a belief that there are costs, lower costs and higher benefits, but some discipline around measuring that and reporting that would help everyone. The board will pay more attention. You can actually take this to your skeptical shareholders and say, look, we actually saved, I don't know the exact dollar number, but here's a range. And then if you reduce this to any standard business NPV decision, a lot of the political pushback, etc., will hopefully go away. So I'd say let's reel back a little bit and think more about, do we have a process to even rigorously think about the lower costs and the higher benefits that might come from sustainability? Because most of the pushback is that, this is just a compliance thing, or you're doing something to vote on your hippie values. Mm-hmm. Well, where's the value conversation? So, some kind of internal discipline and the integration point, which I think somebody talked about. Finance has to get integrated. Accounting, finance has to get integrated with sustainability. You can't have these as separate silos. I think that's the single biggest thing that if I could change, I'd push for.
A great answer.
I just want to echo that, if I could jump in. Sustainability, ESG needs accountants. Absolutely. Totally agree with that point.
Yep, agreed. Wonderful. You guys have all asked some great questions, and we're running out of time here, so let's go straight to the Q&A. Please, everyone who would like, post a question, and if you'd like to address it to anyone in particular, please do, or it can be to any of the panelists. So let's see here. Do we have any questions? Okay, I'm going to start with one. which says that some of these standards tend to be more qualitative in nature, and others tend to be more quantitative in nature, and thus many companies, particularly larger companies, have adopted more than one standard, sometimes doubling and tripling up. Do you think that is the wave of the future, or do you think there will be an international standard that people will focus on, for example, ISSB or others?
I'll make a quick comment and turn it over to the panelists. I think it's good to have a little of both quantitative and qualitative. I do think there are too many standards out there. So I think whittling down to one or two would be very helpful, or having a small group that you can select from would be very helpful.
Well, let me add one more wrinkle here, if I may. So looking at IFRS adoption might be an interesting case study to understand how the ISSB will eventually evolve. My guess is that, you know, there'll be some high-level principles that the ISSB will set, and eventually every jurisdiction will come up with its own version of ISSB. There'll be a Chinese version, there'll be a French version, and that's not necessarily bad because it just tailors that to the you know, local setup. But expecting full comparability is virtually impossible, to be honest with you, because the underlying transactions are not comparable.
Thank you.
Right, and I would add that companies have to do what's material to them. They have to do what matters most, and that cannot be generic. It has to really be what's important to the company. So there needs to be a little bit of tailoring to this.
Great, thank you. Given where we stand right now, do you think we are going to make the 2050 date to achieve net zero as a society? This is open-ended.
I'll jump in again. That's still a long way from, it's a long time from now. There's some interesting developments. Department of Energy has been approving these small modular nuclear reactors that are safer. They're starting to approve them. They're less expensive. We'll have to see where that goes. So I think Shiva might have mentioned before technology. That's going to be key to where we end up in 2050. But there's some interesting developments out there.
Any others want to chime in?
I'm going to say yes as an optimist. I think so. It's in line with the point that Andrew just made. There's an incredible amount of technology and technological innovation being brought to bear. And I think as we have better ways of looking at costs and making costs something that's held by companies and held by investors, innovation is a powerful thing. I can cite lots of examples, but over a 30-year time horizon, and with support of evolving policy, evolving technology, and markets. Markets are an important force as well. I think we're going to accomplish quite a bit.
Great. Thank you. One last question. Given the recent political backlash and volatility, do you think the term ESG will soon be rebranded?
Yeah, let me take that. I find the whole rebranding thing kind of a strange conversation, right? Call it XYZ. It doesn't matter. The underlying questions don't go away. So, this is again, arguably obsessing about labels instead of worrying about substance, which is a problem in the whole area in general. Going back to the milk example, right, Andrea, from before. So the questions don't go away. And maybe this is a good chance for me to think about what are these questions. To me, there are three big issues with ESG, or rather the intellectual contribution that ESG as a movement makes. One, we set the cost of natural capital to zero in our income statements. I don't know what the cost of natural capital is, but it is not zero. Two, our reporting model does a terrible job of capturing the externalities, both positive and negative. What are positive externalities? Pfizer made a lot of money, but they saved the world a lot of money by actually giving us a vaccine. And the third point is the link between the owner and the manager has become virtually non-existent today because of so much passive indexing, too many intermediaries. These are the questions that I think, to me, intellectually ESG raises. So call it whatever, call it GIX, but these questions don't go away. If anything, they're going to get worse and more important.
Great examples. Leaves us all something to ponder. I am afraid we've run out of time, but I want to thank you, PJ, Andrea, and Shiva, for your time and your thoughtfulness today. I hope we can do this again soon. The team at GIX hopes that everyone attending the webinar found today's discussion as interesting and insightful as I did. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and have a great rest of the day.
Shelley, let me commend you on, this is probably the most efficient webinar I've been on. This is incredible, the way you ran it and how it worked. So thank you.
Well, I want to say we're all a part of our inaugural webinar, and we'll have many more to come, but thank you for the compliments. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.